Good evening. I'm David Boyd Haycock, and I'm the curator of the exhibition British Surrealism at Dulwich Picture Gallery. I'm a specialist in British 20th century art, and I curated the exhibition a few years back, The Crisis of Brilliance, 5 young British artists and the Great War, which included Paul Nash, who was one of the leading British surrealists. I'm going to talk to you this evening about the Surrealist exhibition, sadly, obviously closed to visitors, and those paintings are busily getting on doing whatever paintings do when people aren't looking at them. And to sort of think of sort of surreal paintings and what surreal art and surreal paintings might be up to, using that word surrealism, surreal, is what I'm going to sort of try and outline through the course of this talk to you this evening, and to give you some sort of sense of what surrealism was in Britain and what the surreal is. It conjures ideas of the strange, the weird, the mysterious, the odd, the wacky, the funny. The best surrealist art does do all of those things. Its origins were in the First World War. André Breton, who started experimenting with what he would call surrealism in 1920, was the inventor of the movement. The word itself is pretty new. In 1917, it was coined by Guillaume Apollinaire, the French poet, to indicate something that was beyond and above the real, something beyond the real. Breton would expand the idea of the surreal into new and different, exciting sorts of territories. So I'm going to try and give you some sense of the nature of British surrealism, the idea of surrealism, and if you'd like to add some questions as we go along, that would be fantastic, and I'll hopefully answer some of them at the end. And I'm going to look at sort of about 10, 11, 12 of the works from the exhibition to give you a sense of what it's all about, and I hope you enjoy. This is Conroy Maddox's Onanistic typewriter of 1940. It's an insane object. You cannot possibly create anything with this. It's not usable as a typewriter. It would destroy your fingers, a very creative thing you're using to make anything with. And it's amusing, but it's frightening at the same time, as all the best, in my opinion, feeling, surrealist art is. It raises questions, it makes you look again, it makes you return to it, keep coming back to it and thinking, what is the artist trying to do with this? How are we going to exist in a world with such an object in it? And I think that's part of what Maddox is trying to do for us, is to look at the way we look at everyday objects, take them so much for granted, and yet there's a sort of a violence perhaps that exists beneath them, both in that the act of creation, of the mental creation, the imagination of the artist, but then equally also in the society that has produced this object. And there are so many sort of things we can take from a piece of work like Conroy Maddox's typewriter. And we can move on to another of Maddox's works in the exhibition. Conroy Maddox painting, The Lesson, is very much in what I would call the clear tradition of surrealism, the sort of surrealism practiced by the great Belgian painter René Magritte. Magritte was one of the artists that probably brought me into surrealism, and surrealism itself was probably the first artistic movement I was really conscious of as a schoolboy. I was very attracted to his witty, strange, perplexing paintings. And Maddox paints very much in that kind of ilk in this particular work. And it's about all those sort of surrealist key themes of desire, sex, disappointment, aging and death, and also observation of looking, of observing, of the eye of the imagination, that strange eyeball that looks out through one of those windows. One of the great texts, one of the great written pieces of surrealism is Georges Bataille's novella, The Story of the Eye. And looking, seeing is very much a key aspect of surrealism, of how we look at the world around us. Now, we could sort of look stage by stage at the painting and try and dissect it, try and analyse it. has been suggested perhaps that the younger man who's covering his face is looking at stages in his life, periods of his life, disappointments, opportunities, failings, and that the old man, looking sort of slightly ruefully, thoughtfully, is the young man as an older man looking back upon his life. Now, Maddox would not really like me or anyone really to do that with his paintings. There's a key phrase of Maddox's that we've made a lot of use of, that I've made a lot of use of in this exhibition and in the interpretation of the exhibition, which goes like this: a surrealist does not know what he is doing. Dali didn't know what he was doing. I don't know what I'm doing. Something happens and it develops, but you don't analyse it. By doing that, you destroy a surrealist image. So Maddox's argument is that by trying to sort of take a picture apart, we're doing the very opposite of what surrealism wants us to do, which is to use our own imagination, our own interpretation, so that in a way every interpretation of the painting is equal, but equally also invalid. How can we know what the artist was trying to achieve? What is he trying to give us in this painting? It will remain a perpetual puzzle. And that idea of puzzlement, of play, was very key to Maddox's work. So the painting is, for example, dated 1938, when in all probability it was painted in 1970. Maddox hated the idea that his early works from the key period of surrealism up to the Second World War were more valuable than those that he painted after the war into the 1970s, the 1980s. And so he played a game with that, a game in a way with art historians and collectors, saying, okay, well, if you value my early work as more than my recent work, I'll just change the date on it, and then see what you make of that. And that's quite important to understanding Maddox, this idea of gamesmanship, of game playing, of things not being what they appeared to be at first. Surrealism therefore was a puzzle, an enigma, a game, a journey into the unconscious, a journey into all sorts of aspects of human nature, of human politics. Everything was open to the surrealist. Nothing was closed. And the attempt to break through the exterior of the civilized human into what existed beneath was the great ambition of the surrealist. To free ourselves, to be free, to be unshackled, unchained. And that is perhaps what the British artist Edith Rimmington suggests in her collage, Family Tree, from 1938. To me, the collage is one of the great pieces of surrealist collage. Collage, again, something that aimed to break down our way of being ordered and being conventional, and by providing sort of strange juxtapositions of cutting things up, sticking things back together, taking something from anywhere and applying it to a picture, gave this opportunity to show new, unexpected, uncomfortable ways of looking at our world. And Rimmington does that so well in this collage. Well, we have this chain which sort of extends along this jetty out into the sea. We have the moon perhaps in the background, and slithering between the chains we have just seen a snake. It does indicate a suggestion that we are tied to the society that comes before us, our family, all sorts of expectations of who we should be, what we should be, how we should behave. And the surrealists, under Breton's guidance, sought ways, all sorts of ways, of setting us free from the past. But inevitably, of course, the past is and was all around us. And many surrealists in Britain, as they had in France, looked to our ancestors, our artistic ancestors, our literary ancestors. There was a sense, particularly in Britain, that Surrealism was going to be too sort of new, too novel for a British audience to be able to understand. And perhaps by looking back to earlier artists like William Blake and Henry Fuseli, we might get a way of showing how surrealism, the idea of the surrealism, the strange, the odd, the peculiar, had always had a strand in British art, at least from the early Romantic period, if not even going back into the Middle Ages. So if we look at Henry Fuseli's painting here next, that will give you some sense of the way this exhibition attempts to look back at the ancestors of surrealism, to use a word that the surrealists in the 1930s used themselves, this idea of the ancestor of surrealism, to see in what way it has its origins, if you like, in Romantic history. Henry Fuseli, or Fuseli, however you want to pronounce it, was not actually British. He was born in Switzerland, but moved to London as a young adult and trained as an artist, went to Italy, returned to England again and made his career in this country. And in many ways is one of the first great Romantic artists, and was identified by surrealists in the 1930s as one of their forebears, along with Fuseli's friend, contemporary, the great poet, artist, William Blake. Shakespeare is the artist who inspires this painting by Fuseli, Macbeth, Act 1, Scene 3, The Weird Sisters, from around 1783. And Shakespeare, again identified as one of these ancestors of surrealism, who spoke so clearly to the imagination, to the mind, to the strangeness, the weirdness, the wonder of the world, and to get again to this idea of surrealism, looking beneath, looking underneath, really trying to explore the human psychology, the human subconscious from every possible angle. And these surrealist ancestors would play an important part in trying to understand surrealism, but also inspiring surrealist artists. Another great English surrealist writer, pseudo-surrealist ancestor of surrealism, is Lewis Carroll, the author of The Adventures of Alice in Wonderland. And these people were the writers that many of the artists who then went on to become surrealists in the 20th century were inspired by as children. One of the clearest to be influenced by Lewis Carroll and to identify him as one of her sort of ancestors, if you like, to use this word, was the English painter Leonora Carrington, who we'll turn to now. Leonora Carrington is probably the most famous British surrealist. And I say that in the sense of an artist who spent all of their life really as a surrealist. Henry Moore, the great sculptor, is probably the greatest, most famous, internationally known of any British artist who was a surrealist and who, for a period in his career, worked and exhibited with the surrealists. He was treasurer of the 1936 International Exhibition of Surrealism in London, for example. So Henry Moore is the greatest figure in British art to have been a surrealist. We might also look at Paul Nash, who was a very key figure in the surrealist movement in the 1930s, then moved away from surrealism towards the end of his career, though that influence was always there, as it was in so many of those artists who were, for a while, surrealists before moving away from the movement. And one could also mention Graham Sutherland there, and equally also Francis Bacon, who famously was quite keen to be involved in the 1936 Surrealist exhibition in London, but was allegedly told that his works were insufficiently surreal to be included in the exhibition. But Leonora Carrington, who was inspired by that 1936 exhibition, she was given a copy of the catalogue by her mother. She would be an artist who, like Conroy Maddox, would dedicate her whole career to living as and painting as a surrealist, and whose works, when you see them in the same way that Conroy Maddox's are most clearly in the surrealist genre of Magritte and Dali, is instantly identifiable as a surrealist painter. Now, Carrington grew up in Lancashire. Her father was a wealthy textile manufacturer, and her mother was an Irish Roman Catholic. And she grew up in a very big Victorian house, which really quite sort of, overwhelmed her as an impressionable, imaginative young girl. She was also very much interested in the writings of Lewis Carroll, as well as ghost stories and her mother's stories of growing up in Ireland. And she was expected to be a debutante, that she would marry well and move in social circles in high society. She wanted to be an artist, however, and she eventually persuaded her parents to allow her to go to art school in London. And in 1937, at a dinner party in London, she met the great German surrealist and formerly Dadaist Max Ernst. Like many of the great early surrealists, Ernst had first-hand experience of the horrors of the First World War. And he and Leonora eloped together, ran away together. They never married, but they ran away together to France and worked together as surrealist artists, surrealist painters. When France was invaded by Germany in 1940, Max Ernst was arrested as an enemy alien, and Leonora would eventually escape to Spain and Portugal, where she was briefly in a mental hospital, having suffered a mental breakdown. She would escape to New York and eventually settled in Mexico City, where she would spend much of the rest of her life. And it was in Mexico that she painted the two works that we have in the exhibition at Dulwich. The Old Maids from 1947, and consulting my book. The Pomps of the Subsoil, equally from 1947. As well as we have a couple of other works by two drawings and an etching that she made. The drawings are wonderfully imaginative, something sort of like almost Dali-esque in their surrealness. Like Maddox, Carrington would say that you can't really analyse these works, that she didn't go in for explanations, she would say. So when we look closely at something like The Old Maids, we see a real mix of strange figures, strange goings-on, from which Carrington has drawn all sorts of aspects of her life, her experiences growing up. And again, I don't really want to go into the details of trying to understand this painting. I see the figure in blue with the white apron who's so tall. I see her as a sort of Alice in Wonderland figure, but everyone is allowed to make up their own interpretation of what they see in this painting. I don't want to be didactic in trying to inform you of how to look at these works. We see the psychology of the period of surrealism rising out of the First World War and having its peak in the horrors and the traumas of the Second World War. So those bigger cultural issues are there surrounding the work, but equally also what is of such significance is the personal experiences of the artist. Another British surrealist with a similar sort of background to Leonora Carrington was Ithell Colquhoun. She was born in India, where her father was a civil servant. She was educated at Cheltenham Ladies' College, so she came from a sort of upper status British family. She studied at the Slade School of Art, and she went to Paris in the early 1930s and would become very influenced by the surrealists and produced one of my favourite works of British surrealism, The Pine Family, which I think is really one of the recognised sort of classics of not just British surrealism, but international surrealism generally. As I said at the beginning of my lecture, the influence or the importance of danger and humour that combines so well in surrealist art is so clearly there in these sort of castrated figures, a male, a female, a hermaphrodite. We wonder what's happening in this picture, what it's all about. And again, I'm not going to give an explanation. I'm just going to offer it there as this work that frightens us and that makes us laugh sort of at the same time. That's so beautifully painted, and so perplexing in what it sets out to achieve. Now, like so many of the surrealists, Ithell Colquhoun was thrown out of the movement. She was very interested in witchcraft, which was not looked upon very favourably by the key figures, the leading figures in the surrealist movement, of whom André Breton was one, and the Belgian artist E Missens, who came to London and ran the London Gallery, was another. And it's sort of ironic that a movement that aimed to be so liberating, so free, to allow artists, writers to explore all aspects of their imagination, their subconscious, could be so equally didactic on who was allowed to be a member. And you could almost not be a real, true surrealist until you'd been thrown out of the surrealist movement. And I think that's a great shame, because David Gascoigne, who was one of the great English theorists on surrealism, and who wrote the first book in English on surrealism and helped to organise the 1936 exhibition, he said that anybody could be a surrealist, that it was there for all of us, that all we needed was a pile of newspapers and magazines, some scissors and some glue, and we could make collages, we could stick things together. It was there for everybody. The surrealism wasn't about necessarily training for years as a fine artist. It was there for everybody to pick up a paintbrush, to pick up works to make collage, and to create, to explore your imagination. You didn't have to be a brilliant painter to be a brilliant surrealist. It was the ideas that mattered and the exploration of the ideas that was so key to what they were setting out to do, which was to change society. I mean, this is what surrealism was about. It was, in its way, as well as being an artistic and literary movement, a political movement too. And many of the surrealists were involved in politics. So that when the Spanish Civil War broke out in 1936, many of the surrealists wrote propaganda, went even to Spain. Some of them fought in the Spanish Civil War on the side of the Republican government. They wanted to fight fascism. Fascism was everything that was against what surrealism wanted to be, which was the freedom to be whatever you wanted, the freedom to behave how you wanted, to dress as you wanted, to have the sexual relationships that you wanted, to not be confined, to be under any stricture from society or so-called civilization. So the 1930s was a dangerous time. And we see that, the sort of the hint of danger and death in Edward Burroughs' Dancing Skeletons from the Tate Gallery from 1934. Burrough had trained at the Royal College of Art. He came from a well-off family from Rye in East Sussex. He liked to travel. He got abroad a lot. He was in France in the 1920s and 1930s. He was probably the closest that British art, English art, had to a Dadaist. He befriended Paul Nash, and he exhibited at the 1936 London exhibition of international surrealism. But like many of the artists in the British surrealist movement, he signifies or indicates how hard it can be to identify who was a surrealist and who wasn't. Some people were just involved very briefly. Burrough would react against, to a degree, the idea that he had been a surrealist at all. I've mentioned Henry Moore as being there in the surrealist movement, Francis Bacon wanting to be included as a surrealist, Graham Sutherland briefly exhibiting with the surrealists. A great number of British artists through the 1920s and into the 30s and 1940s were deeply influenced by surrealism. It was a deeply influential movement. So some artists would say, no, I wasn't a surrealist at all. John Armstrong being one of the key examples of this, of one of the artists who was picked out by critics in the 1930s as being the leading example of British surrealism, saying he wasn't really a surrealist at all. It never crossed my mind, he would say. So Burrough there too, and Dancing Skeletons is a wonderful, wonderful painting. He was a very skillful painter, worked largely, almost entirely in watercolour. And we have something here that could have been out of a Tim Burton movie. It's amusing, it makes us laugh, but it's also slightly strange, odd, uncomfortable. And in fact, I've mentioned the politics of surrealism. Burrough would be in Spain just shortly before the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War and was horrified by what he saw there, and the destruction particularly of the churches that was going on by supporters of the Republican government. And he would side actually more strongly with the right wing in the end, which was quite unusual amongst British intellectuals of the 1930s. The Spanish Civil War leads me to the sculpture in the mausoleum at Dulwich Picture Gallery by the Irish artist E McWilliam, Spanish Head. It's clearly influenced by McWilliam's friend Henry Moore, and is a statement of outrage, of shock, horror, despair at what was happening in Spain through the course of the Civil War, particularly the destruction of the Basque town of Guernica by German aeroplanes in the early part of 1937, which inspired Picasso's famous painting of the same name, Guernica. And there's a famous anecdote story allegedly by the British Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin saying that if a bunch of communists and a bunch of fascists in Spain wanted to kill each other, that was fine by us because we liked neither fascists nor communists. Now it's this kind of attitude that caused such despair amongst people of the left, artists, intellectuals, not just in England but around the world, and led to so many people volunteering to aid the Spanish Republic in Spain and the foundation of the international brigades, to which many thousands of British men and women would volunteer, and many would die. So McWilliam is inspired in part by Picasso's painting Guernica. We see that same sort of abstraction, that same sense of horror and despair at what was going on in Spain. And McWilliam would later sort of say I wasn't particularly a surrealist. It was there amongst the things that were inspiring him at the time. And as I've said through the course of this was what influenced so many artists through the 1930s and into the 1940s. Surrealism was there as an opportunity, a way of finding and taking ideas. So while some artists were able to dedicate their whole lives to the idea of surrealism, Maddox and Carrington being the two chief British examples, there were others like McWilliam who could find inspiration in surrealist ideas, surrealist methods, and then move on and move away from that in the way that Henry Moore would do. I'm going to close with the artist Marion Adnams. She was born in Derby. She lived most of her life in Derby. She taught art schools there. And she exhibited and had some success in her lifetime. Became obscure really subsequently in the later 20th century and is being sort of rediscovered more recently. I saw her painting L'Enfant Égaré from 1944 in Manchester and was immediately struck by this artist I hadn't ever known before. And yeah, there's something there. There's something very mystical, mysterious, attractive. That painter in a classical sort of surrealist style, what we'd immediately understand as a surrealist painting, where we see something strange, peculiar, ghost-like, mysterious, and deeply, deeply attractive. And I just want to leave her as an example of those so many artists who were influenced by what happened with surrealism and the big explosion of surrealism that occurred in 1936 and 1937 in England because of the International Surrealist Exhibition, which attracted all the great artists who were practicing surrealism at that time. And while surrealism had been in Britain sort of a slow burner, it didn't attract a great deal of attention in the 1920s, but into the 1930s, it became this very fundamentally exciting, influential movement that is, in its way, still with us, that would influence artists in many different ways through the Second World War and into the post-war period. Most exclusively, I would suggest Francis Bacon, who would become the greatest, really, British painter of the second half of the 20th century, and who had wanted to be a part of the Surrealist movement. But many others of all sorts of levels, fame, ability. And what we've hoped to set out to do with the exhibition is to try and inspire visitors, not both in the understanding the history of British Surrealism, but also in taking the ideas, the stimulation of Surrealism in general, and hopefully to come away from that and to be inspired to pick up art materials and to create your own work, and to use it as this liberating ideal that it saw itself as being. Our suggestion at the end of the exhibition is that in the 1960s is the time that all those experiments of surrealism really hit the ground into the wider popular culture, so that something like the pop revolution, the Beatles, the experimentation in youth culture in the 60s has its origins in so much of what the surrealists had been aiming to do in the 1930s, and that the different world we live in now, a century after Breton started making his experiments in automatic writing, has changed the world, has given us part of where we are now. It's not entirely the society they would have liked, but it's far more experimental and far less buttoned up than it had been when Breton set out to start his career, this great inspiration of surrealism. Thank you. Now I'm going to answer a few questions. One of the questions that we've been asked is whether any British surrealist photographers. Surrealism did influence photographers and photography at the time, but I couldn't pick out any that one would say, yes, this was a person who was a surrealist photographer who dedicated their entire work to surrealism. The greatest example of a British surrealist photographer, perhaps, though, is this woman, Lee Miller. British insofar as she was married to the British surrealist Roland Penrose, and Lee Miller was American, and she'd worked with the American surrealist photographer Man Ray in Paris and helped him with his work, influenced his work, was one of his models, muse, mistress, before she then went on later to marry Penrose. So if you want to look into British surrealist photography, Lee Miller would be the place to start. Then a question from Theodore on Instagram asking what makes the British surrealist movement different from the American movement. This is an interesting question, actually, and it's one that came up a few times when the exhibition first opened, and I was asked what was distinctive about British surrealism. And it's a hard one to answer, to be honest, partly because one of the aims of surrealism was to break down those sorts of barriers and boundaries between the ideas of nationalism, of geographical borders, as well as all sorts of borders. I mean, one of the ideas we play with in the exhibition is the breaking down of barriers such as chronology. The exhibition is not laid out in a chronological fashion, and surrealism didn't want to do that. Surrealism didn't want to see it as a movement that had any boundaries or borders, really. And so that one of sort of nationality is one that the surrealists did really try, I think, to reject. So is there a difference between what the British were doing and what American surrealists were doing? I don't think so. I don't know why the British Surrealists don't achieve the same sort of fame as the other international surrealists. There isn't a British equivalent of Dali or Magritte or Max Ernst who has that level of fame. I mean, Leonora Carrington comes closest, but even she is relatively obscure. When I first started researching surrealism in the early 90s, Carrington was still alive back then. She didn't have a degree of fame. You could find her, but she was quite a sort of niche artist. Another question is, what attracts me to modern British art more generally, and what qualities do I admire in it? It's sort of broader than the question of British surrealism generally. I started sort of researching British art, modern British art, from around the period of the First World War, and you can't escape Roger Fry and the Bloomsbury Group. And I just always felt that Fry particularly sort of played down British art, sort of playing second fiddle to what was going on across the Channel in Paris. And I never really felt that was fair. And I like the sort of the romanticism, I suppose, of British art. I love its adoration of yes, the landscape, but also the sort of the spiritual, the mystical, the strange that exists. So that one of the arguments I've made variously about Paul Nash is that almost he was a better surrealist before the word was even invented, when he was making his romantic sort of William Blake, Samuel Palmer inspired works before the First World War than he was when he became a sort of self-conscious surrealist in the 1930s. And I think that's what's attracted me to both to British art and then subsequently to surrealism, was that sense that you get through a lot of British art of something breaking out from beneath the surface. There's something mysterious there. There's something beautiful, yet also strange and slightly weird, slightly uncanny. Emily on Instagram has asked if this is a response to war surrealism, and yes, I think as I've made clear through the talk, war is there both in the origins of surrealism, and then in its peak in the 1930s and 40s through the threat of fascism, and then the horrors and dramas of the Second World War. She asks also if it's much inspired by classical antiquity. I'm not sure if that's an answer I can make, really. I don't know. The surrealists took inspiration from wherever they could find it. Sigmund Freud, one of the great inspirations for surrealism, was obviously very interested himself in classical antiquity. The Oedipus complex being the most obvious reference to his interest in classical ideas and classical mythology. So yes, everything is of an interest to a surrealist. Nothing can be rejected. Find inspiration wherever you look. Take something from the classical world, mix it with something from the modern world. It's all there for us as some kind of idea to take inspiration and to create something new, strange, and mysterious, which obviously classical mythology particularly did so well. Just to think of something like the Minotaur, for example, and Minotaur being the title of the great French surrealist magazine of the 1930s. Lucia Sandin on Instagram asks, who is the most notable British surrealist? As a surrealist artist who devotes their career, their life to surrealism, there has to be, I say, Leonora Carrington. But then I've mentioned Henry Moore, I've mentioned Francis Bacon, Graham Sutherland, three great British artists who had either very close, if brief, involvement with surrealism, to take Sutherland, a much closer involvement in the career of Henry Moore, and then Francis Bacon as someone who would have liked to have been a surrealist and who would use surrealist ideas of chance in his painting through his career, but equally just the interest in psychology, which is so significant to Bacon's work, and trying to penetrate the underlying consciousness of the human spirit and the horror and the awfulness in a way that he sees in mankind. I think those are the big questions we have for the moment, and I'll take some more as they come. Well, thank you for listening to this outline of the exhibition, and I hope you found it enjoyable and interesting. And I'd encourage you, if you want to find out more about the show, to look at the Dulwich Picture Gallery website. There are some more films and videos on YouTube for you to look at. There's also the exhibition catalogue, which I have here, full of wonderful illustrations, fully illustrated essays by myself and a couple of other academic contributors, and it's available from the bookshop. So if you're able to get a hold of that when the gallery reopens, or even able to get a voucher to buy it in advance of the opening, secure your copy, that would be excellent. And I encourage you all the ways you can to support the gallery during this difficult period. And I know there's a lot of material to be seen in all sorts of different ways. So do continue to enjoy art, and I look forward to certainly seeing some of you when the gallery does reopen. Thank you very much. Goodbye.